Welcome to the Rent Collection and Rent Schedules webinar. Today we're going to be covering a few of the panels in COHO that all tie into rental incomes from your tenants. This webinar is going to include the rent collection panels, how to generate a rent schedule for your tenants, manual rent reconciling, credit control, the rent collection settings COGS, reoccurring items, the rent review panel, and the transactions panel. First thing that we're going to cover is how to navigate to the rent collection panel. There is a rent collection panel on the main portfolio page. There is a rent collection panel on each property page. And of course, you can click into a tenancy and look at the rent collection panel there. It's important to understand the differences between the three. So from the main portfolio page here, I'm going to navigate to the rent collection panel. It'll take me down the page and open up the rent collection panel for me. So here we are on the main portfolio page. So it's important to understand that when we're looking at this rent collection panel is going to show us every single property, every single tenancy across the whole portfolio. As this recording goes on, I'm primarily going to be staying on this rent collection panel because it does give me the visibility across the whole portfolio. If I want to look at the rent collection panel at property level, I can simply click into any property that sits on the portfolio. And again, click on the rent collection panel and navigate down to the rent collection panel. And again, it will open it up for me. Now, this rent collection panel being at property level is only going to show me the tenants that are currently occupying the property that I'm looking at. If I'm within a property and I want to look at a tenant's specific rent schedule, if I click into the property or into the room that they currently occupy, and again go down to the rent collection panel, you'll see now that this one does look very different to the other two that we've looked at previously. This is the individual tenant's rent schedule, and the options here are slightly different to what you do get at the main portfolio page or the property rent collection panel. So as you can see by my screen here, I've actually navigated to the main portfolio rent collection panel. Like I said previously, I think this is the best place to come to do any kind of reconciling, because you do have every property and every tenancy in this one panel. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually look at the options that we've got here and explain the subcategories that we do have. So the top level of filtering that you can see at the top here, we are defaulted to overdue. I know that I've clicked on overdue because I've got those hamburger lines in the corner there. I can, of course, click on due today. If I had anything due today, I can also click on this month. I can also click on next month. So that is your top level of filtering. For the purpose of this demonstration, I am going to stay on the overdue. Now, the second level down, as you can see here, I am defaulted again to property. So I'm looking at overdues, and I'm also looking at the properties that are overdue. So at this point, I don't know how it is split out to individual tenants, for example. And if we look at the bottom here, I can see that I've got 2 properties in my portfolio, and I can see that there is overdue rent on both of these properties. Like I said, these properties could have multiple tenants, but it is grouping that money all together on a property basis. The second box here that we've got, tenancy, group rents by tenancy. So if I change to tenancy, I'm still on overdue. I'm going to stay on overdue for the entirety of this demonstration. If I look at the bottom here, it has now split those rental payments out into the individual tenants. So as you can see, I've got 5 tenants here that have all got overdue rents. And I can also see that they are actually in the last 30 days. This is particularly useful tenancy. If you've got a particular tenant, for example, that has got multiple months worth or weeks worth of rents overdue, it will give you a nice grand total of how much money they are overdue by. As you can see here, all of my tenants just owe 1 month. There's none at 60 days or 90 days or more. So it is just 1 month's worth of rent that they owe. The third option here is no grouping, to show all the rents individually. This is the key one for you to do some manual rent reconciling. And for example, like I've just mentioned with the tenancy grouping, if, for example, Jonah was to owe me 3 months worth of rents, at the point that I click no grouping, Jonah is going to appear there 3 times because it's actually going to split those individual rents out for him. So if we click on no grouping, it will look a little bit different at the bottom here because now it's giving me the ability to view these rents. I'm just going to come back up to the top and just point out the further filtering options that I do have. So I have got it set up to include rent records from the 10th of March to the end of the 10th of March as well. I can expand that out. I can reduce it down. So if you just wanted to look for a particular month's worth of rents, you can, of course, do those. I've also got a drop-down box here as well to look at all tenancies, past tenancies, active tenancies, future tenancies, and prospective tenancies as well. There is also a couple of check boxes here at the side to include all previous overdue rent and to include only rent and additional charges. So depending on what you want to look at, you do have those options there as well. On this other section called filter at the side here, this is actually quite useful, especially if your portfolio is particularly large. If, for example, all of your tenants pay on the first of the month and you've got a couple of 100 units, this list is going to be quite long. So you're probably going to want to use some form of filtering to just make that list a little bit more manageable. So I can filter by property for a start. The system knows that there's only 2 properties that have got overdue rent. So if I click on 34 Harvington Avenue, it's just going to get rid of everybody that is not in 34 Harvington Avenue and leave me with that particular property. I've also got a drop-down box to look at all status types: overdue, due today, paid, and upcoming. So if I do want to make any changes there, I can. I'm going to stay on overdue. This is another important one at the side here as well. I am going to be covering very, very shortly how to generate a rent schedule for your tenants. Part of generating a rent schedule for your tenants is to give them a payment reference or type in the payment reference that you've already given to your tenants in order for you to look at your bank and know where that money has come from. So this can also be really, really useful, that if I know the payment reference, I can actually start to type it. And again, it will get rid of the tenants that that payment reference doesn't relate to and leave me with that payment reference or that tenancy line for me to be able to, again, further filtering for you to easily find which tenant you want to record a rent payment for. We've also got tags as well. So you will see in COHO that there is the ability to tag tenancies, for example. So if you want to filter by tag, you can also use the drop-down box there and the tag will be displayed for you. Now, before I start clicking view at the side here and showing you the options that you've got for rent reconciling, I just want to scroll down a little bit further and just give you some further options at the bottom here. So we can log payment. I'm going to be covering that in a little bit more detail very, very shortly, but I can click log payment, choose the property, choose the tenancy, and actually record a rent payment. But I'm going to be showing you that on the individual tenants at the top here. I can also export a CSV as well. So if you do want to pull a report out the system, you are able to click that button and export a CSV. I can also generate a rent statement. This gets asked quite often. So I've just clicked on the button to generate a rent statement. You can do it on a per property basis or for all properties. I can also do it for different money types. I can change my date range. I can include prepayments. I can also include bad debt as well. And I can also show past payments for rent paid in this period. And again, I can create it, which means another window will open for me and I can view all of that information there, or I can generate a CSV export as well. We also have an import rent CSV function as well, which is really quite useful. If you're able to get into your bank and export a CSV from your bank, you can import that rent CSV into COHO. Now, I've just clicked on the Import Rent CSV button, and it is really, really important that you have a look at the guidance and the import template. Different banks will export different CSV information, so it is important to make sure that it fits into the COHO guidelines so that you can actually import it and use that CSV. If we expand this, you will see much, much further information. So if you are looking to use this feature, definitely come and read this information first. And you can also download the template of the structure with all of your tenants. You can click here, and it will give you further information of what our template actually looks like. There is lots of information here, like I said, and then ultimately you can upload your CSV into this file and look at the rents that have been recorded with your bank and look to check those off on the rent collection panel against your tenancies. Now, towards the bottom here, we've got some further sections that we can expand. So the top one being credit control tenancy arrears. I'm going to be covering all of these in a little bit more detail later on. We've also got credit control, escalation policy and templates, and we've also got missing rent charges. Like I said, I'm going to explain these in more detail a little later on. So I've just clicked into a tenancy and gone down to the rent collection panel. This is a little bit different to what we've looked at on the main portfolio page because this is just a rent schedule for the individual tenancy. But there is a few things to look at and a few things to point out. So at the top there, it does read that the rent is to be paid by. It does read unknown here because I haven't selected whether it be bank transfer or standing order or a direct debit, for example. I can also see that the rent is to be paid on the 1st of every month, and I can also see the all-important payment reference as well. So here is an entire rent schedule. I've got some stats at the top there. I can see that £500 is overdue. Got another £500 that is due on the 1st of April. I can see when the last payment was made, and I can also see the percentage of the paid on time statistic as well. So here is the entire rent schedule. This one is a little bit large, so I can show all past as well. So I can expand that. I won't do for the sake of this demonstration, is just not to make this panel a little bit long. I've also got some toggles down at the bottom here as well. So I can show deleted rent records. This is quite useful if you have removed rent records from the rent schedule or another team member has possibly removed rent records. You can see which ones have been deleted and you can actually restore them as well. We can also show payments. If I remove that, you can now see just the rent due records and I can pop those back in again. And I can show rent due items, which is basically the opposite of showing payments as well. So if I just wanted to look at the payments that have been recorded, I can, of course, do that with that toggle. Now at the bottom here, again, we've got that blue log payment button, which I'm going to be covering when I go into the actual reconciling of payments. I can also click to add a rent credit as well. So if I do need to add a credit onto the rent schedule, I can click that button. I can say what the credit amount is for, the date it was given. I can add some notes, and I can also associate the payment with an amount that is due. I can also click add new money due. So if there is anything other that you want to add onto the rent schedule, maybe in a circumstance that a tenant has caused damage maybe at the property and you want to also add that onto their rent schedule because you're expecting that money to be given to you, you are able to log that as well. So you've got some options. So we've got rent, tenant costs, so other costs or charges, tenant money like deposits, holding deposits, rent in advance. I will just sort of note here that if you are taking your tenants through the onboarding in COHO, deposits and holding deposits can be recorded automatically at that stage. So this is more for maybe existing tenants that have already been ticking along in the property quite nicely. You didn't take them through the onboarding through COHO, but you do actually want to add their deposit or their holding deposit onto their rent schedules. And then we've also got arrears as well. So grouping together any past arrears. If you've brought your tenants into COHO and you were using a system before and they do have arrears with you, this can be the best option to actually record those arrears onto their rent schedule as a lump sum payment. We can put in the rent amount. We can also say whether VAT is applicable, and we can put in a due date, and you can also put some optional notes in it as well, so you know what this additional money is in relation to. We've then got a button called Mark All as Paid. Now, if COHO recognises that there is one or more unconfirmed overdue on the rent schedule, you can click Mark All as Paid. So if you've got several lines of unconfirmed overdues, you can just mark all as paid and reconcile all of those payments en masse, so all at the same time. It will actually mark them as paid on the date that they were due. So today being the 10th of March, I have an unconfirmed overdue amount from the 1st of March there. If I mark all as paid, it will reconcile that 1st of March payment and date it as received on the 1st of March, not today's date, which is the 10th of March. We've also got statements. So if you do like to produce a rent statement for your tenants, you can click the statement button. It allows you to choose the money types. Again, we've got a date range there. It can include prepayments, include bad debt, show past payments for rent paid in that period as well. And only for the current tenancy only. Again, we can create it, it will open up another window, or we can generate a CSV. You can also reassociate payments as well. So reassociate all rent payments. This will actually undo all rent associations and go through associating each payment against the oldest rent. Now, it is important to note that this cannot be undone, which is why we're getting this warning here. So if you do feel like there's been a mistake maybe and a rent payment has been missed, for example, you can actually reassociate these payments, and it will just look at the payments that you have logged on the system, go right back to the start of the rent schedule and actually associate them in order. And then at the side here, we've got that import CSV again. So yeah, it's exactly the same as what we've seen on the rent collection panel. If you are using this feature, very, very important to look at that import template to make sure that it coincides with the information that COHO is requiring. At the bottom here, we've got credit control notes as well. So if you do need to add any notes onto the system in regards to the rent schedule, you can do those. You will note that these also tie into the audit log. They will be date and time stamped and also stamped with the user that added the note on. And if we look at the audit log, this will show us all of the rents that have been logged or payments that have been added, again, time stamped and date stamped, and with the user that actually recorded the rental payment. We're now going to look at generating a rent schedule for your tenants. So I have done a previous webinar on the onboarding. The rent schedules, if you're taking a tenant through the onboarding, is actually done throughout the onboarding process. So this is going to look more at how to generate a rent schedule for either existing tenants that have been with you for some time or tenants that haven't come through COHO's onboarding. So I have a tenant here, John Smith. He actually moved into the property on the 8th of April 2024. So he's been with me in one of the properties for a little while, but we don't have a rent schedule created for him on the system. I've clicked into the tenancy. I'm going to scroll down to the rent collection panel. And as you can see here, there is a little bit of a warning there saying that we need to set the day of the month that the rent is due for John Smith, and I can click set day. So it's important to note at this point that it is telling me that I need to set the day of the month. Now, if I scroll up very, very slightly and actually look at the information that we've got at the top here, this is due to me putting him in initially as a tenant. He's paying £750 per month, including bills. So that frequency has already been stated already. There is lots more frequencies in COHO. You can put in weekly, termly, for example. So it is set at that point. So coming back down to the rent collection panel, we're going to click set day. So this is us now creating a rent schedule for John Smith. Like I said, if I'd said that John was paying me weekly, for example, this will change according to the frequency that you have already set. If I chose weekly, for example, on the drop-down box here, I'm literally going to get Monday to Sunday. But I've set him up as being monthly. And COHO is automatically assuming the 8th, because that is the date that he actually moved in to the property. But I can change this and it will prorata the payment for us if I do change it. I'm going to make it the 1st of the month because I want all of my tenants to pay on the 1st of the month for ease. I've also got payment term days as well. So payments will not be overdue late until this many days have passed after their due date. So you can make changes there if you don't want the system to flag it as overdue until X amount of days after the date that it is actually due. I can also choose the payment method. So I've got a drop-down box here. I stated before in that other rent schedule that we looked at that it is set as unknown, but I can change it: standing order, direct debit, a card payment, cash, bank transfer, check, housing benefit, and we do have an other option. I'm going to choose standing order. Now, the next field down is that payment reference. Now, COHO will try and generate you a payment reference for you. This is particularly useful because COHO will make it very, very unique to the individual tenants. You don't have to use it though. If you've got your own ways of creating payment references, we can overtype this if we don't want to use COHO's. This also will become very important, the payment reference, when it comes to looking at the transactions panel. So if you are looking to have the system automatically reconcile for you, it can be very, very useful to just leave COHO's generated payment reference there. Obviously, this does need to be communicated with the tenants to make sure that they are entering the correct payment reference. And you can get more information about payment references by clicking the little I there. There is certain rules that certain banks do use. So we do recommend a payment reference of 10 characters. So definitely have a read of that over, just in case you do need some additional information. We can also add some rent schedule notes. This is completely optional, but if you do need to record any notes at all, there is a little I there to say that rent schedule notes are only visible to the property manager and other team members. So these are not viewable by your tenants. And then if we look down at the bottom here, we've got some options. Now, I have changed the date, which means I've got that warning there to regenerate the rent schedule because it defaulted to the 8th. I have changed it to the 1st. So there is a prompt there that something has changed up here, and I do need to regenerate that schedule. Now, as you can see down at the bottom here, there are only 2 rent lines due. That is because this tenant is assumed already to be periodic. They've been with me for some time already. So any periodic tenants, COHO will automatically keep generating 2 payments ahead of time. Now, I can change this if I want to. So this is quite important to probably speak about existing tenants' rent schedules. So you do have a couple of options, but those couple of options come with a little bit of admin. So you might want to give a thought to how you want those to appear on the system. Now, as you can see here, it's going to automatically generate rent in the periodic tenancy because it has noted that they've gone periodic already. And then you've got another toggle here called future rent only, which is why we're only getting 2 rent payments ahead of time. Now, I can untoggle this if I want to. And what it has now done is generated an entire rent schedule from right back from when John moved into the property. So it's going right back to April the 8th, 2024, when he moved in. And as you can see, it has prorated that first payment because from May the 1st, 2024, I wanted him to pay on the 1st of every month. So it has generated that pro rata payment for us. Now, this can be quite useful when putting an existing tenant on the system to have a complete history of their rent schedule from the point that they moved in. What, of course, you will be left with is a whole bunch of unconfirmed overdues. Now, that would be fine if, of course, your tenant has just paid their rent on time and in full since when they moved in, because when the rent schedule generates, you've got that button to mark all unconfirmed overdue as paid. If your tenants have not been too good, so they've paid late, for example, or they've fallen into some arrears, it may not be a good idea to generate the rent schedule from way back when they moved in, because you are going to have to sit there and look at maybe a spreadsheet or go back to your bank statements, for example, to find out what they did pay and when, for the system to actually reconcile those payments for you. So whereas you can do that, we at COHO, as a rule, would always really sort of encourage you to use the future rent only button. If we do use the future rent only button, what it is then looking at is just the next time this tenant needs to pay. They are paying on the 1st. Today is the 10th of March, so we know that the first payment needs to be made on April the 1st, 2025. Of course, if this tenant did have a lump sum arrears that we do know about, we can, of course, just generate that future rent only rent schedule and then add new money due and put the arrears in as a lump payment. So that is another option for your existing tenants. I'm actually going to leave it as future rent only and just have those 2 payments on the system for me. I can also calculate a pro rata final rent due record as well. So if you do expect that the tenant is going to be moving out on X date, for example, and you've actually set that in the system, we can also pro rata that final rent due record. We can also do the pro rata calculation. COHO will default to monthly, which is the rent divided by days in a specific month. You can, of course, flip it to annually, which is rent multiplied by 12 and divided by 365. Monthly is typically the norm, so I am going to keep it as monthly. And as you can see at the bottom here, I can add a rent due record as well. So if I click that add rent record, I can choose a date period and put in an amount there and click save, and it will add that line onto the rent schedule for me. I can also regenerate as well. So if I do need to regenerate the rent schedule, I can do that here. And I can also clear it completely. So I can get rid of all of the lines and go back to add in a rent record if I wanted to individually add them on. Now, just to also let you know, if you have put your tenant into the system and they're going to be termly rent payers, COHO doesn't have enough information there to actually generate a rent schedule. Termlies are typically different dates in different months and sometimes even for different rent amounts as well. So if you do have termly rent payers, they will be needing to be added on individually with different rent records. I can also copy the rent schedule to others as well. So this is quite useful, especially if you've got students that also are going to have exactly the same rent schedule. You can actually copy the rent schedule to other tenants as well. I've just clicked on the button, but it is saying that there are no tenants because all of the other tenants in this property have already got rent schedules for them, or this tenant is actually in a single let, so there is no other tenant for me to copy the rent schedule to. So what I can do at this point is actually click save because I'm happy with that rent schedule. So that will have saved. I can come down to the rent collection panel. You can see now that the rent is to be paid by standing order on the 1st of each month and with the payment reference. And if I open this up, you'll now see that I've got the entire rent schedule there with exactly the same options of what we've seen on that previous tenancies rent schedule that I showed you a few minutes ago. I'm now going to show you how to manually reconcile a payment in COHO. So I am at the rent collection panel on your main portfolio page because, like I've said, this is probably the easiest place to do all of your rent reconciling because you've got every property and every tenancy all in one panel. It means less clicking around in the system. So I've expanded the panel. I am set to overdue. We've got those hamburger lines in the corner. And I've gone straight for the no grouping because, like I said before, this gives me the ability to view the rent payment and do several things about it. So I'm going to pick on Jonah down at the bottom here, and I'm going to click view. So this section now opens out underneath where I've got a few things that I can actually do. At the side here, I've got some item notes and I've got the credit control notes. So if anything had been set there, and again, I will be talking about credit control in a little bit more detail later on, those would be available there for me. And I can also add my own manual notes on as well. This can be useful, especially if you've spoken to this particular tenant about this rent that is overdue and you've maybe worked out a payment plan with him. He's going to pay half today and he's going to pay half at a later date. We can actually type those notes at the side there so we know exactly what is going on, and the whole team also knows exactly what is going on about this overdue rent payment. Now, I've got some information as well, so I can see the payment reference is half 2. I can also see Jonah's email address as well. I can see that the due date was the 1st of March 2025 and the amount that is due is £675. And I've got the rent period. So this 675, it covers the rental period from March the 1st, 2025 through to March the 31st, 2025. And I've also got a little bit more information here on the description. So the rent was due on the 1st of March and it is currently 1 week overdue. Now, at the bottom, at the very bottom down here, we've got a box there that says this payment appears to be overdue, but this is not yet confirmed. So we can either send the tenant a reminder, we can actually mark it as overdue, which will mean that if the tenant has got access to their rent schedule on their own My COHO dashboard, it will also appear as overdue on their side. And then, of course, we can add a payment. So we've got some options at the bottom here. So I'm actually going to start and go from right to left. So I can mark it as overdue. That's exactly what I've just said before. We can mark it as overdue so that it will appear as overdue on this tenant's rent schedule should they have access to their dashboard. The second option we've got is to actually send Jonah a reminder. So if I click send reminder, this box opens up for us to actually put in a message of our liking. So we can send him a message saying, hi Jonah, not sure if you've realised, but your rent payment is 10 days overdue. And we can also make sure that it is received by him in a couple of different ways as well. COHO knows that Jonah has access to his dashboard, so we'll automatically send him a push notification telling him that there is a rent reminder due message for him to read within his account. We've also got the SMS option there as well. And we can also send it to him via email. And I think when it comes to rent, sending it to them in every sort of disposable way that you do have is probably the best option, just to make sure that that message gets through. If you're sending by email, we can also email preview it as well so that you can actually look at what your message looks like prior to sending that over to this tenant. And at the bottom, we can simply click send. Now, the other option that we've got here is to log payments. Now, I'm going to skip this just for a second and just very briefly talk about the mark 675 as paid on time. This button is your absolute go-to button. This means we're going to click a button and we are reconciling this payment on time and in full. So basically, regardless of it being the 10th of March today, and this being due on the 1st, maybe you are just a little bit behind in getting into COHO and actually reconciling, but Jonah did in fact pay his full rent of £675, and we did receive it on March the 1st. So all I need to do is click that button and it will reconcile this payment for me automatically. Now, the blue log payment button is slightly different. This form opens up underneath. So if I expand this, there is some useful information to sort of understand what the differences are between just reconciling that payment in full and saying it has been paid on time versus logging a payment with that blue button. So the blue log payment button actually allows us to manipulate the amount that has been paid and or change the date that this payment was made to us on. So this can be very useful if you've received a part payment or even more money than what is expected, or you do actually just want to record the full rent amount, but it was actually paid on a different date. And we can also then, of course, change the payment method, and we can also add some notes. Now, it's very, very important to then look at the schedule down here. So this is Jonah's rent schedule. So at this point, COHO is doing some assuming. It's assuming that we're logging a payment for the full amount, which is 675. It's also assuming that we're recording the date as paid for today. That is when we've actually physically clicked that blue log payment button. And also at the bottom here on the rent schedule, COHO is assuming that whatever we are logging here, it has to be in relation to this March 1st payment, because that is the one on the rent schedule that is the newest payment to us. So like I said, we can actually change this. Say, for example, Jonah's paid £375 instead. So he's made a part payment. You will now see at the bottom that that has updated the rent schedule for us. So the March rent of 675 that is due, we are assigning £375 because that is what we're recording up here, and it is going to leave £300 outstanding on Jonah's rent schedule for this March 1st payment. It is really important at this point that you do not uncheck these. You can, of course, allocate this money to a different month, which is why we do give you the option to uncheck them. If you do uncheck them and don't actually check box a rent due record, this money will be logged on the system, but it kind of sits there in limbo, and you will notice that you will have an unassigned rent due record. That means you have logged a rent in the system, but not actually specified what rent due record this money is in relation to. So if you are using that blue log payment button, do make sure that you are actually specifying which rent due record this rent that we are logging is in relation to. Like I said, you will get unassigned rent payments, which you'll then need to go and rectify. This also, like I said, works the other way. So if Jonah wants to pay me £2,025 instead, you will then notice that COHO has assigned that money over March, April, and May for us. So that is quite useful. And again, we can uncheck these and say, actually, it's for March, May, and June, leaving April still remaining there. At the bottom here as well, You've also got the override paid late status. This can be quite useful, especially if you're not too picky about rents being paid maybe on the 2nd or 3rd, for example, if it was due on the 1st, and you don't want to actually add it to their rent schedule and mark it as paid late. So this can be quite useful, especially also if you do have first of the month payers and the first of the month falls on a weekend or maybe a bank holiday like January the 1st, you don't want to necessarily mark it as paid late because that is just because of the weekend and a bank holiday. You can, of course, override the paid late status. And we can do this with donor. So we can say 675 was paid and it was paid on the 10th of March, but we do want to override the paid late status, so not actually mark it as paid late on the system. And now I want to cover what it looks like when you have one of those unassigned payments. So like I said, that is somebody in the team recording a payment on COHO, but not specifying where that money should go. So like I said, it kind of sits in limbo in the system. COHO doesn't know which rent due record to actually assign that money to. So if you look at your rent collection panel, you'll get a warning at the top here saying that we've got one tenancy with an unassigned payment, and we can view that. If we view it, I can see which property it is, which tenancy, and which amount it is for. So if I click view, it will pull me through to the tenant's rent schedule. And looking at the rent schedule, I can see that I've got a March the 1st payment rent due record, and a March 1st payment has been put into the system and it is flagging it as unassigned. So to resolve this, what we need to do is actually click view on the payment that has been logged and click assign. And now again, we're looking at the tenant's rent schedule and COHO is looking to force us to assign that payment to that March 1st rent due record. So all I need to do at this point is click save. And now if we look at the rent schedule, everything looks nice again, and that unassigned payment has gone away. So do make sure that if you are using that blue log payment button on the system for any rent records that are being logged, it is going to be assigned to a rent due record. The next things that we're going to be looking at is the credit control tenancy arrears and the credit control escalation policy and templates. If we expand the credit control tenancy arrears section, you'll see that that nicely lines up with what we've got overdue at the top here in the main rent collection panel. Now, what you can do from the credit control tenancy arrears section is select all tenants or one tenant and choose to bulk send a template to them, which leads me naturally into the credit control escalation policy and template section, because this is where you can actually set up those escalation policies and templates. There is a toggle there to show any archive templates. So these will be ones that you've created before but have chosen to archive them for whatever reason that might be. And we can also create a new credit control template at the bottom here. So if we click new credit control template, you can see that there are 3 types of templates that you can create. There is a manual only, which is a template that will always be sent manually by yourself. There is an absolute arrears. So this is for arrears more than X amount and for late aged by at least X amount of days. And then there is relative arrears. So these are arrears of more than X amount of weeks or months relative to the current rent. If we go for clicking manual only, you can see now that we can choose the notification medium. So that can be sending an email or sending it manually. It's going to be to the tenants. We can give it a reply to email address, which you can see is optional, but if you do want your tenants to reply, it's very important that a reply to email address is entered. You can also enter a CC email address in as well, and again, that is optional. You can give your template a subject title, and then there is a section for the actual body of the email. Now, there is a little eye icon here, which is actually really quite important to take a look at. So what you can actually do here is use some merge fields in your template. So it will pull through that information for you. So we've got some extra credit control merge fields at the bottom here for rent amount, the dates that it was due, the days that it is overdue by, and the amount that it is overdue by as well. So if you do want to create your templates and have some form of the merge fields and using the tags so the information gets pulled into your email automatically from the system, definitely do click on the eye icon and you'll get some further information there. It is very important that you insert them exactly as they are shown below, which includes the tag in the brackets. The brackets are also very, very important. So that is good to note. You can also scroll down a little bit and enter some email attachments. And then there is also a checkbox for the blocking step there. So if checked, this template will be proposed unless skipped by the manager. And then at the bottom, you can name your template or the trigger so that you can easily identify what template it is when you get to sending it from that tenancy arrears credit control section above. And you can create it and you can also preview it to make sure that everything looks okay. Now, if I close this, let's go back up and click new credit control template again. If you do want to go for the absolute arrears or the relative arrears, there are a few other fields that you've got at your disposal there. So this is where you can say how many days overdue or how many days late this needs to be able to trigger the template, and the arrears greater than section as well. And then all the fields below follow the same format of what we've seen on the manual template. Just going to close this one again. Now there is a little I next to the button there to click for a new credit control template. So what is an escalation policy? It is a set of steps, emails, notifications that an organization carries out depending on how late or how many days and how large a tenant's arrears are. Usually the policy is followed loosely, with the credit control manager being given a lot of flexibility to agree repayment plans with tenants. Now, if you don't know where to begin, COHO actually has already built in some proposed escalation policy templates that actually help you to get started. So I'm going to show you what these actually look like. If you are struggling to set them up or you haven't already got some outlined in your processes outside of COHO. So again, if you don't know where to start, it is definitely worth clicking on the proposed escalation policy template to give you a good idea and a bit of a flavor as to the type of templates that you can actually set up. So this will generate an entire credit control escalation policy with emails and actions to be followed. Once created, you can tweak or remove any templates that you don't want to use. Do you want to continue? I'm going to hit OK. I'm just going to toggle off and on again the show archives just so that I can display those. So these are the ones that COHO has got pre-built or pre-generated in the system. So you can see what the criteria is, the type, so whether that be an email or a manual action. We can see the name as well. So this is the name to help us distinguish which bulk template we actually want to use from the tenancy arrears credit control section above. And we can show this, we can edit them, or we can archive them as well if we don't want to use them. And as you can see, we've got various things here going from 1, 2, 3 emails of 2 days, 5 days, 8 days late, right through to section 8 and also some court instructions at the bottom there. So like I said, you can come and use these, you can archive the ones you don't want to use, you can edit them as well to put your own little spin on what those actually do look like. And again, do check out the mail merge tags as well, because that can also make life a lot easier of actually pulling the information through to that email and that template automatically for you. So once we've got our template set up on the credit control escalation policy and template section, we can then expand the tenancy arrears. We can check box which tenant we want to send a template to. And we can use the drop down box here. And as you can see, all of our templates are listed, and we can actually bulk send emails out to all of our tenants, notifying them that their rent payments are overdue, and they're going to get your standard notification templates that you have built into the system. This can be really, really useful. It can definitely save you so much time. So definitely look to expand that credit control escalation policy and template section and have a look at those templates, either the proposed ones, or if you have already got certain processes already in place, you can put your own templates into the system as well. The next section that we're looking at is missing rent charges. So if you ever find that you're missing rent due records, they can actually be displayed here so that you can actually go and make the required changes. So rent due records may have been removed when a user accidentally removed a record due and didn't restore it, or a user has changed a fixed term end date, for example, on a tenancy, and in spite of checking a box to confirm that you will go and review and regenerate the rent schedule, this didn't happen, and it's created gaps in the rent schedule. So if you ever do find that you are missing rent charges, do expand this section on the bottom of the rent collection panel, and you can make the required changes here. The last part of the rent collection section that we're covering today is to actually look at the settings cog. Now, there is a settings cog on the rent collection panel on your main portfolio page, which does differ to the settings cog at property level and on the tenant rent collection panel. So here I am on the main portfolio page. I'm going to click the cog. And now in the rent collection settings, there are some go cardless settings. Currently, this is not enabled for our organisation, and I'm actually not going to go into too much detail on the Go Cardless because we do have an upcoming webinar. So if you are looking to use Go Cardless, definitely take a look at that webinar to see what you can do. But basically, Go Cardless allows you to automatically set up direct debits with your tenants, which can be really useful. And it also ties into our onboarding panel as well in order to take holding fees and move-in monies. So if you do want to use Go Cardless, definitely check out the webinar that is coming up very soon. As I've just mentioned, the rent collection settings cog is different at property level and at tenancy level, as you have just seen for the main portfolio page. On the main portfolio page, you've got the settings cog there to link to Go Cardless. It is different on property and tenancy, and it is exactly the same on the property and the tenancy rent collection panel. So if we click on the settings cog here, you've got a little toggle, which is quite important, and it is asked very frequently. So what you can do here is actually turn on the reminder to check tenant rent payments by creating an action when their rent becomes due. So if you do want the system to alert you when a rent has become overdue, you will need to click into the property and actually come down to the rent collection panel, click on that settings cog and make sure that you have toddled that on. It can be done at tenancy level, like I said, but you're only going to be turning it on for that particular tenancy. So if you do want to do it for a property, for example, every tenancy within a property or across the whole portfolio, do drop into a property, turn on that toddle there, and then you have got the saving options at the bottom. If we save it, we are just saving that as being turned on for this particular property that we happen to be in, or we can save it for all properties. We're now going to be looking at the reoccurring items section. So this ties in quite nicely into the rent schedules. What a reoccurring item is it is a reoccurring tenancy transaction. So obviously we've already talked about generating a rent schedule for your tenants. It is purely for rents. Now, there may be other things that you also want to add in as a tenancy transaction into your tenant's rent schedule that is for something other than just their rents. This is really useful for maybe utility bills or parking charges, for example, or cleaner charges. So these can be really, really useful. What it does is it allows us to set up a reoccurring tenancy transaction, and it slots into their rent schedule and is displayed a little bit differently depending on the description. So rather than it saying rent, it will say whatever you have put in on the description. So what we can do here is add a reoccurring item. So the first thing that COHO is going to request is, what is the property, for example? And then from here, we can select a tenancy. So now it wants some information about the reoccurring charge. So the first option we've got is starting from. Is this going to be the start of the tenancy? So when the rent schedule starts, or are we choosing a different date? If we say pick a different date, it will allow us to change that date at the bottom there. When are we going to continue this to? Is it going to be until the end of the tenancy? So it's just going to keep adding these reoccurring charges on, or is there going to be another date in the future? And again, we can pick a date, and you can see at the bottom there, it will allow us to choose a different date in the future. Then we're going to choose the type. So rent, it obviously should reflect the contract agreement in place. So what is on the tenancy agreement? So this might be, for example, if the tenant is paying part of their rent, but then there is an additional rent charge that you also want to add in. This can be for the housing benefit or something like that. Other gives you the option to put in maybe utility bills, parking charges, cleaner charges, as I mentioned at the beginning. Who earns the income as well? So is this going to be for the property owner? So the property owner will earn the income. This ties into the finances panel as well. And then, or your organization will earn the income directly from the tenant. So this might be in the case of maybe a parking space is there. The tenant is going to pay you £25 a month, for example, for the parking, and that is going to be directly coming into your organizational pot. Then we've got the optional description. So this is where we can actually write what the description is. So it looks very different from the rent items that are already appearing in the rent schedule. So I'm going to enter parking in there. As you can see, it also lists it on that drop-down box because it is a common description that is put in on the system. And then the item details at the bottom. So it's starting from the start of the tenancy. It's also going to continue until the end of the tenancy as well. Like I mentioned, we can change these dates by changing these starting from and continue until dates at the very top there. Then we can say what the amount is. So we can say this is for £25. And we can also repeat this weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annual. And we can also date it on the rent schedule for whatever day of the month. If I change it to weekly, you'll notice there that it has updated the weekly drop-down box as well for us. So really straightforward, and it will change those according to what frequency you're entering. We can also pro-rata the calculation as well. So each month's daily rent is worked out based on the days in that month, or the yearly average. So the daily rate is the same in all months and throughout the year. So that's very much like those different options that you've got for the rent schedule as well. And then what we can do here is actually preview. As you can see there, the system has actually given me an error saying that I can't start it before the tenant has moved in. So I've quickly gone up to the top and selected let me pick. And I've chosen the start of the year there. All the options are the same. And again, I'm going to click preview. Now, what it is allowing me to look at is the reoccurring item preview, which grays out all of the rent payments that are due. And it is, as you can see, it is slotted in all of those parking rent due records or parking due records or reoccurring item due records. So I can just glance down this, make sure that everything is actually okay, and click save. As you can see now, the reoccurring item preview is still there for me. And if I look at the top here, I can see now that I have an active reoccurring items. I can also look at past ones, future ones as well that I've set up to actually start at some point in the future. And I've also got all if I do want to list them all. So I can see the property and room number. I can see my tenant's name, the description, when it's starting from, and how much it is. And if I click view here, I can expand all of the information. I can see when it was created, the rent schedule for what the parking charges is going to look like on this tenant's rent schedule. And as you can see, I can edit this, I can review the rate as well, or I can just delete the reoccurring item entirely. So yeah, just to recap, reoccurring items are for additional tenancy transactions that you want to split out from the rent schedules and put them in separately into the individual rent schedule. Like I said, very good for utility bills, parking charges, cleaner charges, service charges, housing benefit, things like that. The next section that we're actually going to look at is the rent review panel. So this is actually really a useful panel for you to use. There are two sections here. You have tenancies to review and units to review. And I'm going to explain what the differences are between the two. So if we look at the tenancies to review, so I've just clicked on the box and it's expanded this section for me. So as you can see, I've got 12 tenancies across my portfolio. I've got all 12 tenants listed below. So I've got their name, their property address, their fixed term end date. I've got no reviews in process at the moment, and I do have the rent amount that they are currently paying. And then I've also got the unit target as well, and the target percentage, which ties in to the units to review, which I'm going to explain very shortly. So what this panel allows me to do is actually view the tenancy. As you can see, the information expands even further for me, and add in a review tenancy rent. So for example, this tenant is currently in this property and paying $455 per calendar month. Now, I may want to actually do a review of the tenancy, maybe 12 months after that they have moved in. So this allows me to record what rent I am aiming to get from the tenant when we eventually get to the date that I am going to choose. So if I click review tenancy rent or tenancy rent review, it allows me to put in an amount. So here, for example, I can put in 465, for example, and I can actually choose my date in the future that I want to be notified from the system that I'm going to want to do a rent review. I can also review the room target rent as well. So this will obviously tie into the units to review, which I will cover in just a second. And then also there is another checkbox at the bottom here as well, which is quite important. It says, I understand that reviewing this rent will not automatically increase the tenancy rent and that I will need to do this manually. Basically, what this means is entering this information in saying, I want to be able to go to the tenant at this date in the future and increase their rent to this amount of money. It's not automatically going to do it on the system. It obviously does require you to notify the tenant either through COHO or by email that you are expecting to increase their rent and what date that is from. And then also click into the tenancy and click the change rent button at the top of their tenancy to then update the rent schedule once they have been notified. So what this is doing is putting as a reminder in the system that we intend to review the rent at some point in the future and how much that rent is going to increase by. So from here, I can checkbox those. If I choose to review the room target rent as well, I can also make changes to that. Like I said, it does tie into the units to review, which I'm going to explain in just a second. And I can also put in the current room minimum viable rent as well. And I can click save. So once I've clicked save, that tenancy's rent is obviously under review, and I will be able to look at all of those on my dashboard here. So as we can see, I can do the due only, so the ones that I need to do, which is why I'm not seeing the one that I've just completed. But if I unchecked the due only, I'm back to all of my tenants there, and I can see when that next review date is. I can still see how much this tenant is paying, but I can also see how much I intend to increase the rent by. So just to reiterate again, it's definitely worth coming down to this panel, putting in what you're expecting to increase the tenant's rent to in the future. And again, just to reiterate, this is not going to automatically notify tenants of rent increases. It is not automatically going to create those rental increases and update the rent schedules. This is typically just for you to be able to look at what reviews do need to be done in the future and be able to see all of those all in one place. We're now going to look at the units to review. So like I said, the tenancies to review is notifying you that you potentially may want to do a rent review with a tenant that is in situ. The units to review is very different. This is kind of more about market research. This is about knowing potentially how much the property or how much the room could be expected to achieve. So you can do this across the portfolio. As you can see, I've got all of my properties and all of the individual rooms listed as well. So if I was to do some market research, for example, on this road, I might find that there are other HMOs that are getting vastly more rents on their rooms. So I could look and see that other people are charging way more. So I could potentially put in a unit to review as well. So coupled with the tenancies to review, you can only increase your tenancy rent by so much on a yearly basis. The units to review allows you to put in a real sort of top end of what that particular room or that particular property could achieve. And again, I can click view here, review the rent, and it gives me the same options as what we'd got if we're reviewing the tenancy rent. So that is the differences between the two. Tenancies to review is about reviewing the actual tenants that are in situ at the moment and looking to potentially increase in their rent at a later date. The units to review is about your market research and knowing potentially how much you could be getting on that particular property or on that particular room. The last section that we're looking at in this webinar is the transactions panel. So we have spoken about manually rent reconciling in the system or using a CSV import. You may not want to do that. You may actually want to connect your bank accounts to COHO in order for the system to automatically rent reconcile those rent payments for you. If you haven't connected your bank account, you can come down to the transactions panel, click connect, and follow the instructions very carefully on the system in order to connect your bank accounts. Once your bank accounts are connected, you will be able to see all of the connections via the settings cog on the corner there on the transactions panel. Once you have connected your bank account to COHO, our open banking API will scan your bank account and pull through any income transactions that it sees. Now, it's important to understand the criteria that is used at this point in order for COHO to make a 100% match against a tenant's rent schedule. So the criteria that we use is, first and foremost, the date. The date needs to correspond with the date that is on the rent schedule. Now, we have put in a 3-day window on that date because we do acknowledge, like I've said, if you've got first of the month payers, for example, and first of the month falls on a weekend or a bank holiday, you are typically not going to see that money drop into your bank account until potentially the 2nd or 3rd. So there is a 3-day window either side of the date of what is due on that tenant's rent schedule. The next bit of criteria that it will look at is the amount of rent that has been paid, making sure that the amount that is dropped through to your bank corresponds with the amount that is due on a particular tenant's rent schedule. The third bit of criteria that the system looks at is that all-important payment reference, which is why I said very much at the beginning, it is important that tenants do actually use the payment reference that you have set up for them. Now, if they do go beyond the correct payment reference, if they put in something that is slightly different, you are able to actually set a rule. So what that means is you can say, right, this does match to that tenant's rent schedule, but they've used a slightly different payment reference than what was initially set up. But you can ask the system to remember that rule. So then the next time that tenant does pay, the system will look at that rule and then automatically rent reconcile that transaction that has come through. So all being well, the tenant has paid their rent, it's come through to your bank, the date is okay, even with that 3-day window, the rent amount matches, and they have used the correct payment reference, the system will automatically rent reconcile it for you. That is in an ideal world. There may be circumstances where COHO does not automatically match a transaction that has come through, and you can see the partial matches or proposed payment matches on your transactions panel. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on this panel and making sure that you're following the correct processes to actually fully reconcile those payments. At the top of the transactions panel, you've got a green box here as well. So you can look at the last today, 7 days, or the last month. You can see how many transactions have been pulled through and how many proposed matches you have got. And you've got some other options here as well to force the system to fetch bank transactions if you feel like they have come through to your bank, but you're not seeing them in the transactions panel. You can also run the auto matcher and rules as well to make sure that they are being matched. And you can also import the latest Go Cardless payments. And again, I'm not talking about Go Cardless today. We have got a webinar coming up in the near future. We can also see via the transactions panel settings cog at the top here that we do have one or more bank accounts connected. I can click on that cog, see all of those bank accounts that have been connected by us already, and I can delete them and I can add more connections if I do need to. There is no limit to how many bank accounts you can connect via the transactions panel. So if you look down the bottom here, these are what you're going to be faced with if you've got any partial matches. So like I said, this will be dates going even further afield, rent amount not matching, or the payment reference has not matched either. So when I did talk about setting rules for those payment references, if your tenants have used the word rent, every tenant uses the word rent, there's really not a lot you can do about making rules based off of a payment reference that appears as the word rent. So if you can really get your tenants to actually put in the correct payment reference and making sure that they stick to it, it is going to help you immensely. And like I said, as you get payments through, if you can look to set rules for them, so the next time that they do pay, this list of the proposed payment matches is going to get shorter over time. So what we can do is have a look at these proposed matches. So we have one at the side here. We can see the date. This is all of the information on the left-hand side of what has come through from the bank. We've got the date, what the bank is, the account. We've also got the payment reference, and we've got the amount that was dropped in to the bank there. Now, over on the right-hand side here, what COHO will do is try and find you the closest possible match. And what it does rely on you doing is actually eyeballing these and actually okaying them in the middle here. So with this one, we've got an amount of £1,900, but actually the amount that was due was £450. So it may well be, because we've got 5 possible items, it might well be that if we skim through here, this same tenant has actually given us a lump sum, and it is in relation to 5 lots of payments. So what we can do here is associate this money with the proposed match at the side there. If we scroll down to this one here, which appears in orange, again, we've got all of the information that has come through from the bank. And we've also got the payment at the side here. Now, orange ones in the system is reconciling an existing payment. And you've got a little bit of information there saying that the payment already exists. And by clicking OK, you will link or reconcile the bank transaction to the rent payment for this tenancy. What that means is maybe somebody has actually manually rent reconciled it on the rent collection panel, and then we've seen it in the transactions panel. So rather than just getting rid of it, it has been reconciled on the system. We can just OK these and say, right, it was manually reconciled for whatever reason that might be. So yeah, we can OK this one and say, yes, it does relate to that tenancy. So yeah, that is in brief the transactions panel. Definitely worth keeping an eye on these, and maybe worth keeping an eye on the rent collection panel as well. If you are connected your bank account via the transactions panel, this panel should definitely be the first port of call that you come to before looking at the rent collection panel. Like I said, if you do then go and manually rent reconcile, you will find that the system flags that the system has actually already been reconciled in the system. So you will get these orange highlighted transactions through. There is a short video on our YouTube channel as well that just goes into the transactions panel in a little bit more detail. If we scroll all the way down, there is an all transactions section at the bottom here. So where the system scans for income dropping into your bank, the open banking or any open banking API cannot distinguish between what is a tenancy rental income versus what might be other income. So you might have other lump sums of money that are coming from other sources. They will be listed here in the all transactions because the system has just not been able to reconcile it against anybody because it is something random and doesn't fit the criteria for matching on a rent schedule. So when you do have those here, what you can do is click to exclude them and get them out of the all transactions list. And then right down at the bottom, we've got the rent match rules as well. So if you do at a later date want to look at the rent match rules that you have created, then you can actually edit them and you can archive them. But like I said, getting those payment references correct from your tenants is going to help you immensely. I hope that has helped with generating rent schedules, manually rent reconciling, credit control, reoccurring items, rent review, and the transactions panel. I will be on this webinar ready to take any of your questions. So if you do have any questions for me, then do feel free to ask away. Thank you very much. Bye.